You're ready.
This is great. Thank you. Well, we are going to begin. Thank you for joining the Economic Relief Working Group and BSP Research at this press conference. We are going to have Dr. Gabriel Sanchez today going through a PowerPoint, which he will make available to all of the press on the call today, regarding a poll that the Economic Relief Working Group commissioned in mid-December to really get a snapshot of where Latino families and immigrant families were financially as we rounded out 2021. Of course, it makes sense that we are doing this today or this week, because we know that next Tuesday, the budget session of the New Mexico legislature will begin, where over $600 million in ARPA funding will be allocated specifically for issues related to and costs related to COVID-19. And so this is very timely. We want to be able to make sure that our policymakers and our governor have this information in hand. And we are also wanting to, we want our legislators that have a $1.6 billion surplus that they will also be allocating and figuring out how to spend. What are some of the best ways to spend this money to help about 30% of the Latino families that you'll see in the presentation that Dr. Gabriel Sanchez is going to make. The 30% of our communities, for the most part, are still struggling economically. And while we see that, we see and we hear both at the state level as well as the national level that there are many families that have savings and that are going to continue to consume. We know that there's a big chunk of the Latino and immigrant community that is far behind. And so part of what the Economic Relief Working Group is doing is trying to help give the correct information about the state of Latinos in our community today. The Economic Relief Working Group formed in April of 2020 at the onset of the pandemic. And we did it because we wanted to narrow the information gap between governments and the Latino immigrant community and the Spanish-speaking community. So we wanted to make sure we were getting really timely and up-to-date and correct information about all things COVID to our community. But we also wanted to make sure that our policymakers at every level of government were hearing directly from our communities. And the organizations that are a part of the Economic Relief Working Group are Somos Un Pueblo Unido, which is a statewide organization in 8 counties, both rural and urban, as well as CAFE, that's based in Las Cruces, but also has a membership base and works with community in 4 counties in the southern region of our state, El Centro de Igualdad y Derechos, and the Partnership for Community Action, which is based in Albuquerque. And we work very closely with our partners at New Mexico Voices for Children to help really understand the data behind the experiences of our community members in our lives. On today's press conference, we have Dr. Gabriel Sanchez from BSP Research and Polling, who will walk us through some of the salient points that came out of this poll of 1,000 individuals. He'll also talk a little bit about the methodology, and we will also have a few local elected officials who are releasing publicly a letter today to the legislative leadership as well as the governor, calling on them to use some of this ARPA funding to help support and stabilize this segment of our community that is falling far behind other Latinos, people of color, and New Mexicans. And so we will have Councilor Cassandra Gandara from Las Cruces, Commissioner Anna Hansen from Santa Fe, and Councilor Ike Benton from Albuquerque. We will also be hearing from Mirna Loscano from El Centro, who will give testimony and share how some of these economic issues have been facing her and continue to affect her family and community. So for those that are Spanish speaking in our list of attendees, you can go to the interpretation feature para los que hablan español y quisieran escuchar toda la rueda de prensa en español. Vayan a la herramienta abajo de la pantalla donde dice interpretación, y si lo ponen en español pueden escuchar todo lo que estamos diciendo en español. And for those who want to hear Mirna's testimony in English, interpreted into English, just go to the interpretation globe at the bottom right-hand corner, and you will pick the English channel, and you'll be able to hear Laura Whalen do the interpretation. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Gabriel Sanchez from BSP Research polling firm.
Thank you very much, Marcella. It's a great pleasure to be part of this overall collaborative approach on this project on behalf of the coalition of organizations, as Marcella noted, that all work together to commission this poll and make sure that we had hard data as we were approaching the legislative session that has so many consequences, largely for generations of New Mexicans to come. So as Marcella noted, I'm going to spend about 10, maybe 15 minutes walking through the slides from the survey that was conducted recently. And for all of you looking to grab these numbers, note as soon as I finish up the presentation, I will post this slide deck as a PDF in the chat. So you can grab this and grab all the numbers. So don't focus too hard on trying to get any of that information down quickly, because you'll have access to it. You see it was a poll of a large sample of 1,000 Latinos or Hispanics across the state of New Mexico, has a margin of error of plus or minus 3.1%. We made sure in this survey, like we do in most of our New Mexico samples, that we actually had an oversample of foreign-born population or of immigrants. And you see 245 completed interviews with the immigrant population, as well as making sure that the survey was completely bilingual, allowing respondents to choose English or Spanish or go back and forth to the language of their choice, whether they did the survey in telephone format or online. And that resulted in a robust 33% of interviews conducted in Spanish. So I point that out in particular because most surveys that are done of New Mexicans often are not fully bilingual, and we usually get a very small segment of foreign-born or immigrant population or Spanish speakers. So this survey, in contrast, really provides the full voice of all Hispanic or Latino population across the state. A lot of sobering data points. I'll give you a heads up about that now. It's an unfortunate reality for far too many of our families across the state of New Mexico as we continue to weather through the pandemic. And the survey really reflects that. You see that when we look at direct impact of COVID-19 on the Latino community, it's impossible to understate just how devastating it has been for our population. You see that at the time of interview, 28% of respondents reported that they themselves or someone in their household has had COVID-19. Unfortunately, 24%, so almost 1 in 4 Hispanic families across the state of New Mexico has had a family member or a friend pass away due to COVID-19. This jives with all the numbers that the Department of Health has put out in their reporting, which emphasizes that Latinos in New Mexico have suffered higher hospitalization and casualty rates than non-Hispanic whites, and Hispanics are twice as likely to be hospitalized than whites. And in fact, the only racial and ethnic group that has worse numbers across these dimensions than Hispanics or Latinos are the Native American community. So we know that when it comes to direct implications of COVID-19, the impact has been huge for the Latino population. More focused on our topic for conversation this morning is the economic impact of COVID-19 on Latinos in New Mexico. And I'll say the survey has a very comprehensive approach in looking at the economic consequences of the pandemic. We asked a ton of questions trying to dig into the reality facing many Hispanics across the state of New Mexico. And some of these bar charts reflect the reality for far too many of our population across the state. Whether we're talking about difficulty paying bills or utilities at 30%, the 26% of Hispanics across the state of New Mexico indicated that they spent all of their savings and have already gone into debt because of the pandemic, or difficulty paying rent or mortgage at 23%, or the nearly 1 in 5 Hispanics across the state of New Mexico who have lost their job. You see the reality, right? Many of our Hispanic community members are facing very, very difficult times economically. And note that this question was asked specifically within the past year. So this is very sobering data that emphasizes that while many members of our community have moved past the challenges of the last 2 years, far too many are still in the deep reality of trying to navigate the consequences of the pandemic. With the sample size of 1,000, we're able to cut the data across many different factors to see if there's any important variation across our state's communities. And you see that when we look at urban versus rural, our rural residents are suffering more than those that live in urban areas. Whether it's not being able to have paid sick leave, where you see Hispanic members from our rural counties being much more likely to face that reality, or difficulty paying bills or utilities, where individuals who live in rural counties are more likely to indicate that they're facing that challenge. Or very sobering, you see that rural residents at 15% are nearly twice as likely as those that live in urban areas to report that they're at risk of losing their housing right now due to foreclosure or eviction. So again, tough times for everybody across the state, but particularly when we look at rural Hispanic residents, we see really gaping inequalities facing that particular subgroup of the overall population. Consistent with all the work my team has done, as well as other think tanks across the country, we know that gender is a very important factor to consider when we're looking at economic hardship. And that's the reality, unfortunately, here in New Mexico, where Latinas have been particularly hit hard economically relative to Latino males. You see that Latinas are more likely to have difficulty paying for their bills or utilities, 8% more likely than Latino males. Latinas have been more likely to have lost a job, 5% more likely than Latino males, or have unfortunately spent all of their savings or went into debt. So you see across the board, unfortunately, gender is a major storyline when we're thinking about who is facing very difficult economic conditions right now, with Latinas across the board being more likely than Latino males to report that they're facing these difficult, challenging circumstances. This economic reality, unfortunately, is forcing Latinos to make very difficult decisions in response to the pandemic. This just provides you a snapshot of some of those difficult decisions that too many families across our state are being faced with every day. You see 34% of the overall sample indicated that they've had to cut back on buying basic household goods or necessities, right? We know the pandemic is coming at a time where we're seeing inflation really increase the economic stress many families are facing across New Mexico. You see 32% have used up all or most of their savings, right, to pay for basic families' expenses. 28% have had to turn to borrowing money from friends or family. 24% have skipped a monthly car rent, utility, or mortgage payment. And so you see the reality is that for those that are even doing okay right now financially, they're just one tough situation from really being in a very, very worse economic situation for their own families. You see some are unfortunately having to turn to payday or easy loan companies with high interest rates to weather this storm. 19% overall. It's 31% among rural residents of the state. So you see, unfortunately, again, however we look at it, rural residents are having an even more difficult time than the overall Hispanic population. One of the most difficult numbers to take a look at this morning is the very, very low safety net that far too many Latinos in New Mexico have available to them right now to weather this very difficult financial storm. In fact, an alarming 60% of New Mexico's Hispanic population have only $1,000 or less right now in their savings to deal with financial emergencies, 35% with an astonishing $100 or less. Right. So unfortunately, all these difficult, sobering data points that you've seen already is coupled with the fact that folks don't have very little savings right now to lean on to deal with the difficult situations that they're encountering. To provide some context for this economic reality, we asked all respondents for their individual household incomes. These are before taxes numbers, right? Just to give you some semblance of what we're talking about. Overall, you see 28% of Hispanics across the state report making less than $20,000 annually household income in 2020 before taxes. This includes 35% among Latinas who are again suffering more economically than Latino males are. And we see that the Spanish-speaking population of Hispanics across the state are more likely to be in this category of $20,000 annually or less. So that jives with all the numbers that have been presented over the course of the pandemic that show that Hispanic population are more likely to face economic inequalities, including significant gaps in their incomes or earnings. As Marcela noted at the onset, we know that some members of our community are essentially doing about the same financially as they were before the pandemic, and a small segment have actually indicated that they're doing better now than they were before the pandemic. But you see roughly a third, 30 to 35%, depending on which measure we look at across the survey, are doing worse now than they were before the pandemic, right? So we know that about a third of all Hispanics are facing an even more dire economic situation than the other 2/3. And when we really drill down into the data to find out which specific subgroups of the overall population were more likely to report that their situation has gotten worse since the start of the pandemic, we see again Latinas more likely to indicate things are worse now for them than they were before the pandemic. Residents of the state who have lived here for 20 years or greater, you see at 38%. And as you might expect, households with income lower than 40,000, so those on the lower end of the overall economic threshold and those without a college education are both more likely to report that the situation is worse for them now than it was before the pandemic. We wanted to take a look at who is gaining access to any pandemic-driven resources provided by either the federal or state government. And for those that do have access to those resources, what are they doing with it? And you see that overwhelmingly, Latinos across the state who do have access to pandemic resources are utilizing those monies to pay for basic living expenses such as food, clothes, gas, etc. You see another sizable segment indicate that they paid overdue bills, including their rent or mortgage. Some have been able to pay back friends or relatives or pay down creditors. So you see the take-home messages for those folks who are being able to access resources, they're using it to basically weather the economic storm that's facing them right now. That 34% who have paid overdue bills, including rent or mortgage, I want to highlight that number because that tells us that folks are doing the right thing and trying to pay off the bills that they have to stay in their homes. But that does not mean that if they lose their job, if their business goes under, right, economic situations still facing many of our community members, they're going to be right back in the same situation they were before they utilized any resources that they gained access to stay in their homes. The other main take-home message is, although many members of our community are gaining access to resources to help them address the financial struggles that they're facing, not all residents are receiving those resources. And in fact, when you look at any of these different sources of potential aid, and you see we asked a pretty comprehensive list of resources, we see a sizable segment of the overall Latino population that have indicated that they haven't gotten access to any of these resources, including state stimulus checks, SNAP, EBT or WIC, etc. And when we look at the data, we see that Spanish-dominant Hispanics are the population most likely to report that they haven't received any of these resources. And specifically drilling down to specific resources that we asked about, we see significant inequalities based on language. So we know that's correlated with immigration status. So we know that our immigrant families are less likely to be able to gain access to some of these resources because of their status. Another sizable segment that tend to be Spanish dominant who might actually be US citizens face other barriers or challenges, including obviously not being able to get information about these resources available to them in Spanish. We also asked everybody, regardless of whether or not they've received any support over the past year, would gaining any support from the following government programs help improve their situation or make them feel more confident in being able to weather the financial storm that they're facing. And you see overwhelmingly Latinos indicate they need more support right now, whether it's thinking about food-oriented programs like SNAP, EBT, or WIC, or cash assistance programs provided directly to themselves or their family. You see that a large segment of the population, right, 30% or higher in most cases, indicate that they still need some form of government help because they're still struggling financially. Transitioning to the other major theme of the survey, in addition to tracking economic stress, we also wanted to get some indicators of where Latinos stand on public policy priorities and their public policy opinions. Obviously, hoping that this information would be useful for our legislature as they get set to begin the very, very important job of deciding how these resources will be spent and prioritizing those resources. I think one of the biggest take-home messages from the survey in this regard is when we ask folks to identify what are the most important issues that they want New Mexico's governor and the state legislature to address, when we isolate the top 5, they're all about economic priorities, right? Whether it's helping New Mexicans struggling financially due to the pandemic, addressing the need for more affordable housing, the rising cost of living across the state of New Mexico, or creating jobs with better wages. You see 4 of the top 5 issues identified by the Hispanic population across the state of New Mexico all had to deal with financial assistance and economic issues. I think sending a very loud message to our legislature that right now is the time to do something to try to address these concerns among not only the Hispanic population, obviously, but our data suggests for that segment of our community, economic priorities really are the key for them as we look to the next legislative session. When we asked about public policy preferences, specifically for resource allocation, really trying to cue what should the legislature do with the resources that they have available to them, you see overwhelming support across a number of different priority issue areas, including providing more direct cash assistance to low-income families who are impacted economically by the pandemic, investing more funding in workforce development opportunities and job training, decreasing the cost of college tuition for residents, et cetera. I don't think I need to read these all to you because you'll have the slide deck when I finish up. You see the overwhelming majority of Hispanics across New Mexico support these priorities when we're thinking about allocation of resources, including at 75%, expanding unemployment insurance to all workers, regardless of their immigration status. Respondents also prioritize workers' rights, whether it's expanding paid sick leave so that all hardworking New Mexicans don't have to worry about that right now at 74%, or the 70% of respondents who indicate the state legislature should do all they can right now to ensure that employers across the state provide the Latino population with living wages and fair and safe working environments. We know far too many of the Latino population in particular have been in harm's way, just trying to do their job, unfortunately being exposed to COVID through the unfortunate reality of their jobs, putting them in more direct contact with everyday New Mexicans. We really wanted to provide the legislature with information about the very difficult decisions that they have to make about funding. In essence, right, do they put this into the rainy day fund in our reserve accounts, or do they spend it now? So we asked respondents directly about their opinion on this subject. And you see that the majority, 53%, of Hispanics across the state of New Mexico say, if I'm posed with this very difficult decision, I want the legislature to use these funds now to provide direct assistance for working families who are still struggling to catch up on their bills and living expenses, in contrast to the 36% who indicate that it makes more sense to them to put these funds in the rainy day fund to use for emergencies so that the state budget doesn't face realities down the line. So hopefully seeing this direct contrast and the fact that Hispanics want these funds to be used now for direct cash assistance is useful as we all try to advocate on behalf of our families with the legislature. Finally, when we ask Hispanic population across the state how they feel about providing access to government resources to residents regardless of citizenship status, you see overwhelmingly Hispanics at 88% think it's important that all hardworking New Mexicans, including undocumented immigrants, have access to the same government resources as everyone else. And we know from the survey that a lot of Hispanics view this question from the vantage point of recognizing, regardless of immigration status, being able to have access to these basic resources improves the situation for all of us right now across the state of New Mexico. And I think this is reflected in the fact that you see respondents indicate that it's important to them for public safety reasons that all New Mexico residents, again, regardless of immigration status, need to feel that they can report crimes to the police, such as domestic violence or sexual assault, without fear of deportation. Similarly, right, the population feels overwhelmingly that expanding access to health insurance for all New Mexico residents, regardless of undocumented status, is another just basic and important policy move that protects all of us by ensuring that everybody, regardless of their immigration status, has access to health insurance. We know that improves uptake of the vaccine and a number of other important public health benefits. So I'll pause there. I hope this data was useful and informative. And I, again, will make sure that I share this in the chat as soon as I close out so that you have access to all of those data points. Thank you very much for allowing me time to share these results with you.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez. And for media in our list of attendees, you can start to put questions in the Q&A as we hear from local elected officials from Las Cruces, Albuquerque, and Santa Fe. And Dr. Sanchez will stay on at the end to answer questions specifically about the poll. In the meantime, he can put his contact information as well as the PDF version of this slide deck into the chat so that you all can download it and have it on hand. We are now going to hear from some key local elected officials from the cities and counties that really have invested CARES Act money, ARPA money, and other funding for direct cash assistance, noting that low-wage workers, essential workers, people of color, struggling families in their communities, immigrants really do need this leg up. So we're going to hear first. Well, I would also like to say that all of these individuals, along with about 45 other local elected officials from rural communities, urban communities, signed on to a letter which they will be forwarding to the governor as well as the legislators today, calling on them to use ARPA funding to continue and other funding to continue to support folks who have been excluded from federal stimulus and unemployment benefits, as well as other COVID relief benefits. So we're first going to hear from City Councilor and Mayor Pro Tem of Las Cruces, Cassandra Gandara.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. Thanks to Vivi Arsendia from Café for inviting me here today to say a few words. As I sat preparing for my statement, I was reminded about those first few weeks of the lockdown during a pandemic and how fearful we all were about ensuring we had our basic needs met. For me, public safety and equality well-being of my constituency during this pandemic has been a top priority. To ensure that our medical personnel, first responders, service industry, and our gente overall had the necessary survival and thriving services that include protective equipment while they were serving our community was a must. Many of our Latinos, to include our immigrant brothers and sisters, risked their own lives so that we could have food, shelter, and safety in our communities. I am forever grateful to each of you for showing up every day so that we could, as a community, survive. With statistics that a large segment of our Hispanic population that also include immigrants only earned less than $20,000 in 2020, and 30% had difficulty paying their bills, to include our Latina women struggling to come out of the pandemic financially, should give us pause. As a city councilor working on reducing homelessness, poverty, food insecurity, etc., I am advocating that our state officials use budget surplus and ARPA funding for inclusive economic recovery here in our beautiful state of New Mexico. I'm imploring our governor and state legislators to use the ARPA funding and the budget surplus to assist the most vulnerable of populations. With this, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Councilor Gandara. We are now going to hear from the City Council President of Albuquerque, Isaac Benton. Councilor, you can please unmute yourself. There we go.
Thank you. Buenos días a todos. Yes, the city has stepped up. I want to thank my fellow councilors and the mayor for their attention to these critical issues for Hispanos, but especially in the case of undocumented immigrants and mixed families, of course, which is tragic as well. And now we are asking the state to help. We've all got to be in this together with the state, and the state's in a unique position to help with these critical issues this year. As was stated in the report, some of the worst stress, economic stress during these especially difficult times has been on Latinas and on longtime New Mexicans, a disproportionate stress. So it says a lot about inequities in our society and where we need to pitch in and address these issues. Over the years, I've supported, of course, payday loan, interest rate reform, and those issues that reside at the state. This is also a time when we've got to catch up with the minimum wage and living wage question, but these specific issues with regard to immigrants are critical. And those, we know, it's in the news all the time, that immigrants are hardworking people who who start their own businesses and their frontline workers. So critical during the pandemic, both of those, yet they've had the most, immigrants have had some of the most difficult time accessing any help. These small businesses and workers are critical to our economy. They do pay taxes, yet they cannot access, as the rest of us do, the relief funds. So I'm proud to sign this letter. We've got to catch up on all these fronts. I know our friends in the legislature understand as well, but this is a time to put this in the forefront and to really get something done. So thanks to everyone on the call. Gracias a todos atendiendo la llamada, and let's move forward and have a real good effort at the state legislature. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Benton. I would just like to let folks know who are attending the webinar that El Centro de Igualdad y Derechos is going to be dropping in a PDF version of the letter that's going to legislators, legislative leadership, as well as the governor's office today. They're going to drop that in a PDF. And I also would like just to remind folks that the Economic Relief Working Group has worked with the legislature in the past to open up funds for HSD. At the end of 2020, there was $5 million that was put in with the use of CARES Act money. In 2021 from the general fund, another $5 million, but those were distributed a year ago and 6 months ago and 9 months ago. And so we're part of this is to ensure that more funding is being put into those HSD funds. And we'll hear a little bit about that towards the end of the press conference from Governme. And I can see that the elected sign-on letter has been dropped in. So please download that to see who has signed on. So we are now going to Commissioner Santa Fe County Commissioner Anna Hansen from District 2. Thank you, Commissioner.
I want to thank you. I want to thank BSP Research and Somos Un Pueblo Unido for organizing this. To me, I also want to recognize that our commission, the Santa Fe County Commission, supported this unanimously. Santa Fe County has committed $1 million federal ARPA funding to support struggling working families with cash assistance. This will help cover some of the basic living expenses for the most vulnerable families and children in my district, including those who were excluded from stimulus rebates and unemployment benefits. Santa Fe, our legislators need to recognize the ongoing problem and help fill the gap with the ARPA funding. Our community deserves and needs our help, as Santa Fe County Commission has recognized. I think that it is really important that we recognize that the resurgence of COVID infection rate has among essential workers and school-aged children, school closures and mandate quarantines have put an additional financial strain on our families earning low income and making it even more difficult for them to catch up and take full advantage of the state's.
It looks like we lost Commissioner Hansen. Her internet must have gone out. Oh, I see her coming back in. Go ahead and finish, Commissioner Hansen.
Very much. I'm sorry about that. I don't know where I left off, but I was talking about the mandatory quarantines that have put additional financial strain on our families. I live in a district that had a tremendous amount of people who are essential workers, and I see how serious it is that they are struggling during especially this resurgence of COVID. And we really need to be on the front line. Santa Fe County is working with the city of Santa Fe to distribute this cash assistance of 1 million. The city will be approving this, or hopefully improving this in February. How much of the amount of money they will be also contributing to the fund. But this is essential that we all work together to distribute and help our essential workers and working families and people who have been left out of the stimulus funding. So with that, I thank everyone who has spoke, my fellow colleagues. This letter is so important. It is so important for the legislature to be part of our team in taking care of the children, the families who are providing many services throughout our county and throughout the state. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Once again, I just want to remind folks that the letter that Commissioner Hansen, along with about 50 local elected officials from across the state, is in the chat, and I, as well as the major and salient points from the 1,000 person poll that BSP polling and research firm did. And so we can also, if you put your information in, send you the press release and the press packet related to this. We're now going to hear from Mirna Lascano, a member of El Centro de Igualdad y Derechos, who will be speaking to her family's experience in Spanish. And so for those folks who would like to hear the complete interpretation, just make sure that your interpretation tool at the bottom right-hand side of your screen is on the English channel, and you will hear the interpretation provided by Laura Whalen today. Mirna, si quiere prender su cámara, por favor, y empezar su testimonio. There we go.
Sí.
Sí podemos escucharla, pero todavía no podemos verla. Si puede poner.
Ok. Mi cámara.
Perfecto, gracias.
Sí.
Lista.
Ok, gracias. Pues buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Mirna Lascano. Soy madre inmigrante de 3 hijas, miembro del Centro de Igualdad y Derecho y trabajadora esencial del hogar, de cuidado infantil y limpieza de casa. Estamos orgullosos de que miles de familias de Nuevo México como la mía hayan sido beneficiadas por iniciativas de alivio financiero local y estatal. La cantidad de familias que han venido aplicando por estas ayudas y el rápido agotamiento de los fondos de estos programas demuestra la gran necesidad por la que nuestra comunidad está pasando. Durante la pandemia, mi esposo, trabajador de la construcción, y yo hemos experimentado una gran deuda financiera al ser cortadas nuestras horas de trabajo. Nos enfermamos de COVID y mis deudas de atención médica aumentaron. Mi esposo es el pilar económico de nuestra familia y el único con trabajo fuera de casa. Vivimos día a día para abonar a las deudas de los biles atrasados, para evitar que desconecten los servicios públicos. El costo de vida del consumidor en el estado ha aumentado, pero nuestros salarios no, resultando en limitaciones en mi hogar, limitando incluso el consumo de carnes, buscando los productos más económicos para poder rendir al máximo los ingresos que tenemos. Nos hemos visto obligados a usar las despensas comunitarias para solventar la inseguridad alimentaria. La lucha comunitaria continúa para que el Estado siga extendiendo el alivio financiero a cientos de familias como la mía que tanto necesitamos. Puedo hablar personalmente sobre el impacto que estos programas brindados por la administración local han tenido en mi familia. A través de estos alivios financieros locales, hemos podido pagar los biles, pagar la colegiatura de mi hija y en gran parte alimentar a mi familia. Hago un llamado a todos los legisladores y a la gobernadora para que sigan apoyando los alivios financieros que tanto nos han ayudado en estos tiempos difíciles. Los alivios financieros son una inversión directa en nuestra comunidad. Son un respaldo del gobierno local que honra la labor y los esfuerzos de todos los que aquí nos levantamos todos los días a trabajar por un mejor futuro para nuestra comunidad. Estamos orgullosos de construir y aportar a la economía local a través de la creación de pequeños negocios como contribuyentes de impuestos y como trabajadores, y de no rendirnos a pesar de las dificultades para que el proceso productivo de nuestro estado no se detuviera ni siquiera en medio de una pandemia. Me siento orgullosa porque Nuevo México es mi hogar. Es el lugar donde hemos visto crecer a nuestra familia. Estamos orgullosos de ser nuevos mexicanos. Gracias por su atención y su apoyo.
Gracias, Mirna. And lastly, we will have Viviana from, let me just make sure I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, Viviana Arciniega, who is a community organizer with New Mexico Cafe, partners of the Economic Relief Working Group, to talk a little bit about what we're really pushing and needing from the legislature next week and in the coming month.
Thank you, Marcela. Good afternoon, buenas tardes. So because ARPA funding is meant in part to decrease the spread of the virus and support economic stabilization for households, we have come up with 3 proposals or 3 ways that, that the New Mexico legislature can help excluded families who did not receive any economic relief during the pandemic make a strong and equitable recovery. One of those ways is to allocate $15.6 million of ARPA funds to the Human Service Department to provide $600 to 26,000 low-income adults who did not receive the 3 federal stimulus rebates. Another way is to allocate approximately $110 million to the Taxation and Revenue Department to provide a one-time $600 rebate to all low-income families or filers who qualify for the state's working family tax credit and whose income is less than $31,000 if single or $39,000 if filing jointly. Lastly, another is to allocate an additional $25 to $30 million to Taxation and Revenue Department to provide low-income families who are newly eligible for the Working Families Tax Credit with additional tax rebate of $600. So we know that a lot of families, a lot of Hispanic New Mexicans continue to earn low wages and cannot pay for their basic needs such as rent and utilities, and are facing debt and food insecurity. So this would be a great way to help our families who are struggling and are in great need of financial help. Thank you, Marcela.
Thank you, Viviana. And we would just like to again remind reporters that this providing economic relief to families who were either very low income or mixed status families who did not receive any of the federal stimulus, and in some cases state stimulus, that there's a track record that the state and some of our localities have in being able to provide emergency cash assistance and relief. And as others mentioned on this call today, we're seeing a lot of folks having to quarantine, stay home from work because their kids are out of school or because there are people in their workplaces that have COVID. And we also would like to remind folks that the vast majority of essential workers in this predicament don't currently have sick leave. While the legislature enacted a sick leave law and the governor passed it, an mandated earned sick leave law in the 2021 legislative session, it won't go into effect until July 1st of 2022, and that's when workers will begin to accumulate. So many of the folks in this moment who are having to stay home because of school closures or because of their kids quarantining or themselves quarantining momentarily are missing out on some of that funding. So this really is the perfect time to ensure that these folks have a little shot in the arm, a little lifeline, which is what, as Dr. Sanchez pointed out in his presentation, is cash assistance is generally used for basic living expenses. And that's really where we have a big chunk of our communities really struggling right now. So with that, we are going to open it up. There has definitely been in the past this funding available. There is funding available now at the state level, not just for mixed status families, but for all struggling families who continued to be low income in 2021. And so we are going to see if you have any questions. There is a Q&A function. You can also put the questions in the chat towards our speakers. And Dr. Sanchez is still on. He's going to provide his phone number, hopefully in the chat, so that folks can reach out to him as well. Steve Jansen is asking about press materials. And so let me just pull up this chat here. So we have your email, Steve. Thank you. I did note you, and we will send our press release along with this slide deck, another memo that Dr. Sanchez put together from BSP polling firm, as well as the testimonies that we have. And we'll also provide information that we're providing to legislators about what some of the economic needs are and what we need from both general fund and ARPA funding this year. So any questions to Dr. Sanchez or the counselors who are on? And I just do want to note that Commissioner Hansen had to leave. I am not seeing any questions at this point, but I do see that Dr. Sanchez put in his phone number and his email, gabe@bspresearch.com.
Good morning. I have a question, or afternoon. I have a question. My name is Laura and I live in Santa Fe. If we want to volunteer or support pushing this or talking to anybody that works during the legislative session, is there anything we can do to help now that we're living here? Because I live in Santa Fe.
That's great. Thank you, Laura. Yeah, so Somos Un Pueblo Unido, along with all of the organizations that are participating on today's call, are going to be following the session, talking to legislators. We already have a number of champions who really want to push this, push the use of ARPA funding and other funding for this kind of relief. And really glad you asked that question, because I completely forgot to mention that on January 24th, we are sponsoring Immigrant and Workers' Day of Action, just like our coalition does every year, to really focus on the stories and the struggling families that are behind. And so if you are a part of one of these organizations, please check us out on Facebook and Twitter, and we will put that information in there. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm still not seeing, unless I'm pretty sure our Q&A function is functioning. And so I'm still not seeing any questions. So thank you very much for participating and for being a part of this press conference. We have taken a screenshot of all of the folks that are on, and we will be sure to send you via email the press packet.